The Switch 2 versus the Steam Deck. It's a compelling matchup. Nintendo's brand new portable hybrid paired up against Valve's handheld PC. Conceptually, these devices diverge, but they align in form factor and usage patterns. So which portable powerhouse takes the performance crown? And how do they compare in day-to-day use? Let's start with game performance. I think Hogwarts Legacy is a fascinating example of the kinds of differences we might expect to see between Switch 2 and Steam Deck. All kind of divergences pop out here, with the Steam Deck enjoying improved texture resolution, higher fidelity assets, better baked lighting, and enhanced volumetrics. Steam Deck is running the PC version of the game, which gets the benefit of certain settings boosts for current-gen consoles, while the Switch 2 falls closely in line with the PS4 release. We're also able to bump up tweakables a little, operating at the medium settings preset on Steam Deck, which means some improvements like denser foliage. Switch 2 earns a relatively paltry set of enhancements in comparison. Switch 2's primary edge lies in image clarity, as the game appears to upsample a 540p internal resolution to 1080p using one of the Switch 2's lighter DLSS versions. The deck instead operates at 480p, going to 720p with FSR 3. Both suffer from a healthy amount of breakup as the Switch 2 struggles with this occlusion and the deck fails to resolve clean foliage. I'm comparing the Switch 2 in its portable configuration here to provide a one-to-one matchup for handheld play. But the Switch 2 has one key edge: performance. Hogwarts Legacy suffers from distracting frame time issues on Steam Deck, usually little 50 millisecond drops, though they can extend deeper at times. Expect to see these fairly often when traversing the game world, especially in Hogwarts and Hogsmeade. I'm using the SteamOS framerate cap here, as the game's built-in cap produces awful frame times. Switch 2 is comparatively smooth. It's hard to tell if VRR is working correctly, but regardless it feels like a decently stable 30 FPS with only relatively rare interruptions. We're basically seeing the merits of the console approach here. Switch 2 gets a tailored version of the game that may have cutbacks, but runs well on the hardware, while Steam Deck has to cope with the PC version. The PC code only really works well on higher-end machines, and is especially demanding on the CPU in particular, which is a common Steam Deck pain point. Kunitsugami Path of the Goddess is up next. This title gets a lot of mileage out of what appears to be full-fat DLSS on the Switch 2, judging by the upscaling quality and the character of its artifacts. Internally, the game is running at roughly 360p, but the output is around 720p or so. That compares favorably to the Steam Deck's FSR, despite running from a lower resolution internally. Unfortunately, Kunitsu runs unlocked on Switch 2, in classic Capcom fashion, and it also runs without VRR, at least for the most part, with poorly paced frames and typical content. We can match the Switch 2's general performance profile on deck easily enough if we'd like, with an equally unsatisfying run of play on both systems. Visual settings here favor the Steam Deck, but I'd venture that the Switch 2 is ultimately the more satisfying experience, if only because DLSS is a more capable upscaler than FSR in this title. There's also an option to use so-called TAA, but like other RE Engine games on PC, it doesn't appear to work. Then there's Yakuza 0, which is a game that should be pretty easy to run for both systems. Switch 2 in handheld mode turns in a roughly 864p image, falling short of a perfect pixel match for its 1080p display. On Steam Deck, a native 720p at maximum settings is very much achievable, which has some advantages and disadvantages relative to the Switch's higher but unevenly scaled resolution. Both appear to run at a steady 60 FPS. The Steam Deck can be bumped to a higher refresh rate if you want, but you do risk some framerate drops. These three games represent three different prongs of the Switch 2 lineup: games with lightweight DLSS, games with expensive DLSS, and games that don't use DLSS at all. DLSS is a clear asset here, and it helps to equalize the fight against Steam Deck, which otherwise seems to have a small edge over the portable Switch 2. But then there's docked play. Here the Switch 2 comes out ahead of Steam Deck. We can push Hogwarts to 1080p on deck by dropping a settings preset, but it doesn't necessarily compare favorably to Switch 2 for higher resolution displays. The Switch 2 output is sharper and clearer, improving on the FSR resolve on Steam Deck, and the drop to low settings provides a closer, though still imperfect match to the Switch 2. Performance on deck is similar to the game running at 720p, with an annoying habit of dropping frames during open world traversal. Switch 2 is comparatively smooth, generally putting out a stable 33ms update with only relatively rare dips below. It's not quite as faultless as the current gen machines targeting the same 30fps update, but I don't really have any complaints. With Kinetsugami, we don't really have the latitude to push resolution much further on deck, so I've kept the game running with our prior settings options here. Image quality takes a further step on Switch 2 though, with a higher internal resolution at around 720p and a substantially crisper output. Comparing the two, there's no contest. Switch 2 is delivering a much higher quality image and a much higher quality rendition of this game. Performance-wise, both machines deliver a fairly similar turnout here, though on average Switch 2 is a bit ahead. In my experience, this is fairly typical on Switch 2, scoring a solid win over Steam Deck when empowered with docked clocks. In Yakuza, the game now renders at 1080p internally, again with a solid lock on its 60fps target. Steam Deck can be bumped up to match, but we can't push it any further without risking dropped frames. In docked configuration, it's essentially a draw. There was some reporting that this game was 4K pre-launch, but a 1080p pixel count in dock mode lines up with our April pixel counts and also matches the PS4 version. I did notice some texture enhancements on Switch 2 though, like on these signs, which are lower res on Steam Deck. This applies in portable mode too, but it's more obvious at the higher resolution. In portable mode, Switch 2 tends to be competitive with Steam Deck, but in docked play it pulls ahead in demanding software. Visual comparisons though don't get at the full docked experience, which I think overwhelmingly favors Switch 2. The Switch seamlessly kicks your game into a display mode suitable for your TV, with upgraded graphics, and increases the GPU and memory clock rate automatically. Controllers are supported without issue, with an easy interface to assign different control options as needed. You can wake the system quite easily with controller input. Plus, if you want to unplug your unit to take it with you, there's no need to worry. You'll be able to continue just as you did before, just with a portable optimized graphics configuration. On Steam Deck, the docked experience is a lot rougher. There's no automatic settings adjustment, of course, to match the TV. So by default, you'll usually be getting a scaled 800p or 720p image to fit a much higher resolution panel. Games often feature cursor-oriented launchers, which don't work with a controller, and Bluetooth controller support can be spotty, with disconnections and other issues. Both systems have access to large pools of legacy software in addition to more recent games, and here I think Steam Deck is substantially better off. Switch 2 has very good backwards compatibility by console standards, but it can't match the flexibility of Steam Deck. In a game like Crysis 2 Remastered, we get all kinds of settings upgrades including better indirect lighting, superior textures, and improved foliage, alongside a higher frame rate. We can't quite manage 60fps here, but 40fps is very achievable most of the time, and easy to cap to at an 80Hz refresh on the OLED model. The Switch 2 looks fine and it does run better than Switch 1, but the Steam Deck is able to bring all its hardware grunt to bear. Likewise, Wreckfest gets a big Steam Deck OLED boost. On Switch 1 and 2, we land a 540p version of the game at 30fps, while Steam Deck can bump that up to 720p 60. We also get the benefit of crisper textures, more refined lighting, and more detailed foliage. These kinds of improvements would take developer time and effort to bring to Switch 2, but we don't need to worry about any of that on Steam Deck OLED. Even games that are far less demanding can fare better on Steam Deck. Take the Ace Attorney Apollo Justice Collection, for instance. Steam Deck and Switch 2 look essentially identical here, with a matching 720p resolution and a hard-coded 30fps update on both platforms. But the 720p resolution proves a perfect pixel match for Steam Deck, while it scales somewhat inelegantly to the Switch 2's 1080p panel. If the Steam Deck had a higher resolution screen, it would be no problem to output it at a greater pixel count, of course, because we have that configuration freedom. Thankfully, there are quite a few prominent exceptions to this backwards compatibility deficit on Switch 2. Many Nintendo published titles run with higher resolutions and better frame rates on Switch 2, either as part of Switch 2 upgrades or paid Switch 2 editions. Titles like Super Mario Odyssey, The Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening, and Splatoon 3 run far better on Switch 2 than its 8-year-old predecessor. Some third-party games like Fortnite and No Man's Sky have received Switch 2 versions as well. Hopefully more developers will be able to patch in higher performance Switch 2 settings over time, or will be able to do more extensive work to improve their game's visual presentation on the new console. In those legacy games, both Switch 2 and Steam Deck players can expect longer than usual battery life. Persona 4 Golden lasts 4 hours and change in this test with the screen on max brightness here on Switch 2. This is originally a PS2 title, but it does run at 720p 60 on Switch, so it's probably representative of what we'd expect from a lighter 3D game. Steam Deck logs an estimated time of over 7 hours with a roughly matched brightness level, which suggests a much longer runtime. When the Steam Deck's SoC is running at near 0 wattage, the system can last quite a while. Interestingly, the Switch OLED logs over 6 hours in the same test at max brightness, which is a good deal better than the new console. I couldn't find any testing online on backwards compatibility battery life, but it does seem like the Switch 2 has worse battery life in Switch 1 software relative to SWOLED, and likely the 2019 Marico revision as well. Nintendo's back compat solution may not be terribly efficient on the large T239 SoC compared to running natively on a Marico Tegra X1. I tested Hogwarts Legacy as well, where I logged 2 hours and 45 minutes with the screen on max brightness in this scene. This is a pretty impressive duration for a demanding 3D title, especially considering the system's minimum quoted battery life of about 2 hours. Steam Deck OLED scores closer to 4 hours, however, either targeting 720p 30 with the medium settings preset or 1080p 30 with low. Neither of which is a perfect match for the Switch 2, but they're generally comparable. That's a healthy Steam Deck victory. But the Switch 2 has a much smaller battery than the Steam Deck OLED, at 19.7 watt-hours versus 15 watt-hours, so it consumes dramatically less power. In Hogwarts Legacy, the Switch 2 clocks in with a power draw of about 7 watts, while the Steam Deck OLED is around 14 watts. That efficiency is seriously impressive, and likely comes down to a very finely tuned Switch 2 SoC. Now that we've established the performance pecking order, I think we should sample the hardware in the two systems. The Switch 2's display issues are well documented, particularly its panel response times. Essentially, the LCD doesn't transition quickly enough when it's refreshed, leaving behind an after image that persists for several frames using high frame rate footage, like this 180 FPS capture. Expect worse results from the Switch 1 LCD, which you should be able to perceive in these slow motion tests. Brightness control and overall luminance comprise the second major concern. Basically, the Switch 2 has a uniformly lit LCD without local dimming, which seriously limits the ability of the panel to express the brightness deltas needed for HDR content. And the panel tops out at around 400 nits according to objective tests, which is far lower than the 1000 nits most HDR content is mastered for. Finally, the panel has mediocre native contrast, clocking in somewhere around 1100 to 1 in most tests. That's fine for a typical mobile LCD, but it pales in comparison to a lot of modern TV display technologies, which can deliver perceptually infinite contrast. But this is where the Steam Deck OLED is at its strongest. With OLED tech, you can expect near instant response times, minimizing blur. In these comparisons, my OLED appears very clean even in fast motion, while the Switch 2 is a bit of a blurry mess. HDR is no problem for the panel either, reaching a full 1000 nits in bright content, a perfect match for the HDR10 display standard. I'm running both displays at max brightness here, and the difference can be profound. It's a dramatic improvement over the Switch 2's display. And OLED pixels are emissive, without the need for a backlight. For dark, deep blacks, you can simply turn off the offending pixels, with none of the near black graying that LCDs are known for. Switch 2 unfortunately doesn't really have the display chops to match the Steam Deck OLED, with a far inferior panel, especially for well-mastered HDR content. There are a few factors that do fall in the Switch 2's favor though. The Switch 2 panel is capable of 120Hz, beating the OLED's 90Hz maximum, and can use VRR. Few games effectively exploit these features so far, but they give developers latitude to target performance profiles that wouldn't be possible on the OLED, or would yield poor visual results. Plus, the Switch 2 packs a much greater resolution, at 1920 by 1080. This is a mixed blessing due to scaling issues, but a lot of games do a good job achieving a crisp 1080p image on the portable panel. Games in the Steam Deck often appear slightly pixelated in comparison, especially in their 2D elements. The Switch 2 appears to have at least one lightweight DLSS variant, capable of taking games to 1080p without a large frame time hit. Then there are a few matters that will come down to personal taste. Switch 2 has a roughly 8% larger display in terms of screen area, almost matching the Steam Deck in height, but exceeding it somewhat in width. The Switch 2 is about at the limit of comfort for a handheld for me, but opinions will vary here. Color temperature on the Switch 2 is pretty cold, at over 7500K according to third-party measurements, while the Steam Deck is warmer. Notionally, the deck has the ability to change the color temperature in software, but the slider doesn't seem to alter the display as much as indicated. Form factor differs considerably between the two handhelds. Switch 2 strikes a svelte profile, while Steam Deck OLED is substantially thicker, with large built-in grips. A lot of players will find the deck a more ergonomic option out of the box, but one advantage of the Switch 2's bare minimum design is that it's easy to outfit the system with a variety of cases to improve the feel of the system. Steam Deck isn't quite as customizable to match user tastes. The deck is a bit heavier at 640 grams, while the Switch 2 reaches 534 grams. But keep in mind that if you take my advice and outfit your Switch with a case, that weight will come up right about to the deck's level. Neither machine feels excessive in handheld form, but both exceed the weight of historical handheld systems by some margin. Controls are a bit controversial. The Steam Deck has an unusual layout in service of its dual trackpads, which flank the display. Traditional PC games, including strategy titles and MMOs, are typically playable on the handheld with some tweaking because of those trackpads, but some, including myself, struggle with the layout for some more action-oriented titles, particularly with the deeply inset position of the analog sticks. Plus, the system has fairly weak rumble. Switch 2 has a more conventional layout, and it has powerful and precise rumble functionality. The layout generally agrees with me and my RSI-prone wrists, and the overall quality of the control setup is hard to critique. More exotic titles that might demand cursor input though might not be well suited to Switch 2, at least in its handheld configuration. Not having a traditional D-pad is going to put a damper on a lot of 2D games, and the lack of analog triggers has considerable impacts on a subset of games, mostly racing titles that depend on partial inputs for actions like braking and accelerating. Moving on to device software, SteamOS is solid, but it doesn't compare favorably to a full-blown console. There are elements to the Steam Deck interface that require touch input, like some sections of the Steam Store. Stability is also more of a concern, and sleeping and waking can even be quite inconsistent, sometimes requiring a full device restart. Switch 2 has a thoroughly tested, controller-driven interface, which has been perfectly stable for me so far. As much as I dislike some of Nintendo's changes to the virtual game card system, I still find the system overall easier to use than Steam Deck. And it has Game Chat and Game Share, which don't necessarily have good analogs on Steam Deck. Obviously, it's impressive that Valve, which is a relatively small company, has been able to produce a handheld OS that far exceeds any competing PC-based platform, but people who are used to the ease of a console system may find it a bit rough in comparison. On the flip side, the deck offers vastly more configuration options for individual games. With the Switch 2, it's much more of a traditional console experience, where games are set to work in a limited number of ways. That flexibility helps a lot with dealing with the vast variety of PC software that the deck can host, which stretches back over decades. Switch 2 can't really compete with this library of titles. Most games with controller support are bound to be a good experience, save games with compatibility issues or heavy performance demands. But Switch 2 does have the benefit of Nintendo exclusive titles, which is a hard advantage to discount. Steam Deck's games are games that you could play on any PC system, and most popular titles are accessible on home console platforms as well. Exclusives have historically been a huge part of console platforms, and Nintendo is steadfastly committed to the traditional console model. Valve can't offer corresponding exclusivity for Steam Deck, but they can offer an array of third-party titles that completely dwarfs the Switch 2. It is worth mentioning though that some of those third-party titles like Star Wars Outlaws are likely to be much more playable on a Switch 2 than a Steam Deck. Wild Hearts is a good example. The game runs at a very playable performance level on Switch 2, while Steam Deck performance is pretty poor. The Switch 2 has customized lower than low settings, which are probably helping a lot here. Steam Deck may be exhibiting some compatibility issues here as well, which do pop up with the occasional title on SteamOS. I think the Switch 2 is better as a console-like device than the Steam Deck is. It offers a streamlined, stress-free experience for playing controller-oriented games. The OS is rock solid, it docks perfectly, and it has great exclusive games. It's a more enjoyable, delightful machine to use moment to moment. If you want a slick gaming experience, it's hard to go wrong here, but it doesn't have the flexibility of a PC handheld. It can't access thousands upon thousands of PC games. You can't add special launch parameters, change up settings, swap refresh rates, or check out performance overlays. And you don't have the control options to make cursor-oriented software work on the go. So each machine has its strengths. The Switch 2 is a great machine to enjoy a game like Cyberpunk 2077, or exclusives like Mario Kart World or Fast Fusion. But a game like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV benefits enormously from having trackpad input, and the deck can play a larger variety of software, including older games that will probably never get a Switch 2 release. It's kind of an intractable battle, a fight between a console and essentially a PC in a console suit. Personal preferences and priorities are going to dictate this one, but I think most gamers will find a lot to like in both devices. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.